So in this case, John's using this phrase little children to address his audience. And he's giving them a very basic teaching. Let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. All right, so notice here, this is a standard example of a kind of Semitic contrast or Semitic, it's an antithetical parallelism, is what scholars call it. But it just means you set up a contrast, not this, but this. But you don't mean in an absolute way, not this. It's just a way of saying this and how much more this. So he's saying, let us not love in word and speech. And he doesn't mean that we shouldn't be loving in our words. What he's saying is that we can't merely love people through what we say. We also have to add actions to our words. So basically, this is the Johannine equivalent, the John's equivalent of what we find in the letter of James, right? Faith without works is dead. It's not enough just to confess Jesus is Lord with your mouth. You actually have to live according to that confession with your works. So he's calling the spiritual children in his congregation to remember that they can't just speak the truth, they have to act the truth. They have to live by the truth. They have to walk in love. And then he goes on to say, by this we shall know we are of the truth and reassure our hearts before God whenever they condemn us. And he says, beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God. We receive from him whatever we ask. Why? Because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him. So notice the emphasis here is on keeping the commandments, on our actions, on our works. And this is really important for us to see, because when we look at, 1 John chapter 3, verse 18, when he says, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed, we tend to associate love primarily with an emotion, like an emotional attraction to someone, or an emotional delight in something, right? I love this person, or I love donuts, or something like that. Like we might take delight in some kind of sensible pleasure. But what John is referring to when he speaks of love is an action. It's a choice that you make, right? We don't just feel love, we do it, right? Agape is the Greek word that he's using there. And so the way we express love and the way we abide in God, who is love, is to keep his commandments. Now, for many of us, when we think about the commandments, we think about the commandments primarily as rules, right? Like rules for life. If you want to get ahead, keep the commandments. Like if you want to be okay with God, if you want to get right with God, you keep the commandments. And that's, of course, true. They are rules on a certain level. But the rationale for the rules, the deeper meaning behind the rules, is completely oriented toward love. So the first commandments against blasphemy, idolatry, and breaking the Sabbath, or commandments ordered toward the love of God. That's how you love God. You don't blaspheme him, you don't commit idolatry, and you keep the Sabbath holy. And then the second set of commandments are ordered toward love of neighbor, right? We don't kill, we don't steal, we don't commit adultery, we don't covet, right? We don't bear false witness. So the actual heart of the commandments is to do love, is to live in love. And that's what John's laying out here, that we have to walk in the commandments and love God and love neighbor, because this is what pleases God, right? When we keep his commandments. Now, that's, of course, the 10 commandments. But Jesus in the Gospel of St. John is going to add a new commandment, right? He's going to give to the disciples to love one another as he has loved us, right? As he has loved the disciples. Then John goes on to say, this is his commandment, meaning the Father's commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. All right, pause there. So what is this singular commandment that John is referring to, that Jesus commanded us? Well, this is an allusion to the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 34 to 35. If you recall, you go back to the Gospel of John, when Jesus is with the disciples at the Last Supper, in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he pours out his blood, and in Luke he says, this is my blood of the new covenant. So he makes a new sacred bond with them. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't just speak of a new covenant like he does in Synoptics, but he speaks rather of a new commandment, right? So John he supplements the testimony of the Synoptics. And in John 13, 34, 35, Jesus says to the disciples, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Okay, so if you go back to 1 John, when John is talking about keeping the commandment of Christ, right, that we love one another as he commanded us, that's an allusion to Jesus' new commandment at the Last Supper. So the kind of love, this is important, that John is calling his congregation to in this epistle is not just the love of neighbor or the love of God we see in the Ten Commandments. That's the baseline, right? Yes, you shouldn't blaspheme. Yes, you shouldn't commit adultery. Yes, you shouldn't steal. But he's actually calling his audience, the readers of this letter, and then the church is calling us during Easter, to love as Christ loved, which isn't just avoiding committing grave evil against someone else, against your neighbor, but actually embracing sacrificial love for the neighbor, laying down our lives, laying down our will for the sake of another, for the sake of the other. That's loving as Christ commanded us, right? And what's fascinating about this, in the last line, John goes on to say, all who keep his commandments abide in him, and he in them. All right, pause there. This is really, really crucial. Especially an older generation of Catholics probably would have been familiar with the fact, with the teaching in the catechism, like the Baltimore Catechism, something like that, that if we keep the commandment, that we have to keep the commandments, 10 commandments, in order to remain in a state of grace, right? That to violate one of the 10 commandments in a grave way is a mortal sin and would remove us from the state of grace and put us in a state of mortal sin. Most people are familiar with that concept. But John goes even further. He says that when we keep Jesus' commandments, we don't just remain in a state of grace. That's not the language he uses. What he says is that we abide in Christ and that Christ abides in us. So that's the language of mysticism, the language of abiding. It's a Greek word, meno, M-E-N-O. It's the same word Jesus uses in the Gospel of John in chapter 6 when he says, whoever eats my flesh abides in me and I in him, right? So if you want to have mystical union with Jesus in John chapter 6, if you want him to dwell within you and you want somehow to dwell in him, in his mystical body, you have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And I think many Catholics have a pretty good idea of that idea of a sacramental union with Christ, right? In Holy Communion, we're united to Christ. He's united to us. He dwells in us and we dwell in him. But we tend not to have as clear a notion of the mystical union that flows from obedience to the commandments. John's saying here, not the only kind of mystical union we have is not just the sacramental union of the Eucharist. It's also the union of obedience. Whoever keeps his commandments dwells in Christ, and he in them. And the obvious implication, too, is that if we break one of those commandments, and John will actually go on in chapter 5 to talk about deadly sin, that isn't just the violation of the rule, it's the destruction, it's the violation of a relationship whereby Christ does not abide in us if we violate those commandments, if we commit a mortal sin.